I think we're going to kick off. I yeah, I wanted to give a warm welcome. Alyssa, I don't know how many of your teachers you can see on the screen, but yeah, can you give me any sense of how many you've got here? I'm just wondering how many I should welcome.
I don't see any familiar names, but I have just written in our chat, and um, some of them they are still
Okay,
on their way,
perfect.
they say. Yeah.
Okay, no problems. So I would like to still send a warm welcome to Alyssa and her students and at Nardit. Nardit is the Namibia Desert Environmental Education Trust. And I would also like to extend if there are any students from the nature conservation students from the universities in Namibia. They're also very welcome, and any other audience that are joining us. I would like to ask the question before we start off, whether there's anybody in this room that can tell us, give a guess about what green building is all about. And then after that, I'm going to introduce Nina and we'll go into her talk. So yeah, I think I'm definitely going to learn a lot about the subject. But is there anybody that wants to kick us off in a little chat about what building is all about? It's a bit of a I've jumped everybody into this. Okay, so if I have nobody coming forward, then it means that we definitely need this talk. Um, and Nina, I'm
I
really
mean,
happy that you're going to.
I can
Yes,
say
Andreas.
something, yes, but I didn't want to take it away
No
from
probs.
somebody else. Yeah, I think for me, like the green building, I mean, if you say something green nowadays, it's a very loaded word nowadays because you get greenwashing and you get lots of people using it. But I think for me, green building is trying to integrate a building, because if you build something like an accommodation or something for yourself, you are putting something into a natural space that wasn't there before. And I think it is trying to integrate it as much as possible into its surrounding, visually and aesthetically. I think that's one aspect. And then the second aspect would be functionality, in a sense that how it works minimizes impact of resources, that you don't use unnecessary resources. And then the third part, I think for me, would be building material, trying to use the natural resources of the area, or have something that is reused, recycled, or that is not damaging to the environment before or after the build, or the lasting of the building. So that would be kind of the three aspects that I would understand.
Fantastic. Nina, what do you think about that?
Well, that about sums it up. Should I still give the talk? No,
excellent.
Like Andreas has said, it is a loaded term and there are lots of interpretations. But I think also what one must realize is that there are lots of approaches, and some things work better in certain areas than in other areas. Yes, it's about context, really. The context is very important wherever you are.
Okay, so I think with that, I'm going to lead into my introduction to Nina, because there's some parts where she herself has put it very beautifully. So much of Namibia, as many of you know, has very little arable rain, making it difficult to live profitably off the land. The challenge here, where livelihood is a constraint, is that there are fewer resources and populations are poorer, in need of shelter and amenities. Nina has formulated an approach that is uniquely suited to her home country. It starts with a budget as constraint and site as opportunity. What emerges is a low-cost, albeit exuberant architecture filled with contextual references and stories. And then there was a little article in a platform called Ecogradia, which is devoted to sustainable architecture and urbanism. And I highlighted a couple of parts of it. Can necessity unlock greater innovation? How to create an architecture of delight and renown when the climate is harsh, resources are scarce, and budgets are tight. Can less ever become something more? Nina Moritz is a maverick architect from Namibia who succeeds in creating efficient and appealing buildings despite tight budgets, difficult to reach sites, and harsh climates. Less is more is her approach to an architecture that, despite these challenges, enhances the human condition without damaging the environment. She founded her eponymous firm 25 years ago, which now has I know I can't pronounce this word, oeuvre, I think. Sorry, Nina. That defies categorization. Her buildings are somewhat rational, vernacular, sensible, rooted in climate and site, striving for passive comfort. Sometimes they are outright idiosyncratic, organic, poetic, and deeply personal. And then a little bit that Nina herself wrote very beautifully. I design in and around the landscape, not on it. I'm going to just repeat that. I design in and around the landscape, not on it. I think that's a very important point because that way you preserve biodiversity. You have a low footprint and you don't damage. Very beautiful, Nina. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to present this talk. I hope you enjoy it. When you think of green buildings, you probably think solar panels, alternative materials, and energy-efficient light bulbs. These are part of it, but not always, and definitely not all. It's a little more complex and at the same time also more simple than that. This talk might contain a lot of facts, but the important thing I would like you to take away is a basic understanding of green building, a kind of building eco-literacy, rather than focusing on things like solar panels or light bulbs. So when you're confronted with a question of whether a specific building element or activity is or will be green, we can start with the basics. What supports all life on Earth? Without soil, air, sun and water, there'd be no life on Earth, no us, no buildings. We and buildings need the environment, and thus we and buildings also affect the environment. Here are some of the inputs provided by soil, air, sun and water. You can look at the detail afterwards. But what do we put back into the soil, air, sun and water? Aish, not so good. Some facts. Construction alone contributes a significant proportion of negative impacts on the environment. You don't need to know the figures. You need to understand that it does. It paints rather a grim picture, doesn't it? Thus we know that infrastructure exploits nature in terms of resources and waste. Green building aims to minimize the use of these resources and reduce its environmental impact. People are also moving to the term sustainable construction to indicate an even bigger effort. I'm using the term green building as an umbrella for it all, but just to show you that the jargon is changing from green and sustainable building through to restorative, which aims to restore nature to what it was, and regenerative. Regenerative infrastructure design wants to put back more into the environment than what it takes out. It uses terms like net positive, which I'll explain later. One shouldn't think of a green building as an object. It's a kind of philosophy, a way of thinking that underpins the process of planning, making, and using the built environment. Such a philosophy will guide decision-making in the process. Good decisions can only be made based on sound green answers to quite a lot of questions. For example, why do we want to build? Our school population is going to double soon. We need more space. What must we build? A new school or more facilities at our existing school? For who are we building? Learners, but also the additional teachers we need. However, do we really need a new school? Or can we use our existing facilities? Classrooms are only used in the morning. Can we add an afternoon shift to make use of our existing space? Then we might only need to build new teachers' housing instead of duplicating what we have. So you can see, sometimes the best decision is not to build. If there's no other way, renovating an existing building is second best. And if you must build new, make it as small, efficient, and as green as possible. Once we've decided to build, we should ask where. Some locations are more green than others. A greenfield site is undisturbed nature, whereas a brownfield site has already been damaged or disturbed by humans. It's always best to use a brownfield if available, which can be rehabilitated through the construction process. Here are some examples of the impact of location. The Namibian Student Financial Assistance Building was built miles away from the tertiary training institutions in Windhoek. Does that make sense? Most of our low-income housing is built on the outskirts of towns, far away from transports, jobs and shops. Namibia was even going to build a hydropower dam right over Whooper Falls, which would have obliterated a unique ecological site, which also contains ancestral graves. Once a site has been selected, the actual design comes into play. How do we use the site in a green way? When we talk about the footprint, people mostly think we refer to the carbon footprint, but it can also mean impact in a much broader sense, the overall impact on the environment, not just the area there, as well as the physical footprint of the building. Because our housing is built as little single-story buildings, each on their own earth, we spread it over a large area, which is called urban sprawl. This means not only destroying a lot of land which could have provided ecosystem services, but also chasing up the cost. It means that more than 25% of a house's cost goes into land and servicing the land. Some people even estimate that as much as 39%. We could reduce the cost of housing by about 20% if we build in a much more compact way. Here are two schools on the same scale with similar learner numbers. Omontele on the left is a standard ministry design, and it spreads out the administration, classrooms, library, all the school activities as separate single-story buildings. See the yellow rectangle. Rukongo on the right combines all of these activities in a double-story courtyard building. So you can see its yellow rectangle is much smaller. You can also compare the size of the land required. A red rectangle is Omontele, much larger in area than the green rectangle, which is Rukonga. If you look at the hostels, Rukonga's 10 hostels are double-story and houses the full school population, and Omontele's 3 single-story hostels houses only a portion. Here you can see Rukonga's double-story courtyard building. And yes, there is a ramp as well, not just a staircase. Not only is Rukonga's physical footprint smaller, but it's much easier to manage the school as everything is close by. So Rukonga School actually is the best or second best performing school in Namibia when it comes to grade 12 results since it was built. Site layout design has to take many physical aspects into account, like orientation, which is where wind comes from, slope, existing vegetations, etc. For example, soil. You probably know all about the layers that soil has, and that only the surface layer and topsoil is really suitable for plants to grow in. A green building must take this into account. Usually people put in a bulldozer to flatten the entire site, ignoring what happens to the topsoil and destroying all the vegetation. A green design, on the other hand, will retain the existing vegetation and only clear specific areas, those within the building footprint and within a reasonable working space around it. The builder will then also remove the topsoil and set it aside for reuse, for planting areas or rehabilitation of damaged areas. All designs use site zoning to decide on the infrastructure layout, but green design takes it a bit further by looking at how outside areas can be incorporated with the inside so that they can spill out and communicate with each other better. It looks at outside areas that can be used for activities, existing natural areas that are to be protected. It adds a lot of vegetation, and it tries to enhance the absorption of stormwater into the soil instead of letting it run away. Stormwater management in a green building sense is very different from stormwater management in a conventional building sense. Green design also develops the linkages and overlaps between the different zones in much more detail, looking for opportunities where these can merge, thus reducing the building's footprint even more. In a country like ours, where the weather is most of the time good enough for being outside, we should use more of our outside for our activities so that we can build less. Passive design is like warfare. It refers to making use of the building envelope itself to keep people comfortable inside and to avoid costly mechanical equipment that need energy and extensive maintenance. Why I say warfare is that it's done by applying various tactics in the design, such as the correct orientation, shading the building, insulating the roofs, planting around it, fenestration, and so on. Fenestration is the design of window location, size, and shape, and can have a big influence on how much heat the building takes in and how much it gives off. You all know how the greenhouse effect warms the earth. The exact same principle works on buildings. Long-wave radiation comes through the windows and heats up the inside. Some materials, like tiled or concrete floors, absorb a lot of the heat. The heat is then emitted as shortwave radiation, and it cannot go out through glass or walls or roofs and stays inside, like a car. The only way to get rid of excess heat is ventilation, by cross-ventilation through openings placed opposite each other. One opening is not enough. Or one can use the stack effect, the fact that heat rises. In a building, heat tends to settle in heat layers. The lower the ceiling, the closer the heat is to your head and the hotter you feel. So high ceilings are cooler. High-level openings, which can be put in the roofs or in the walls, use a stack effect's air movement to vent the heat at the top. Without using passive strategies, you need expensive air conditioning that uses a lot of energy and has a lot of negative impact on the environment. But you might think, my house is cold, we're in winter now. Correct orientation, which is facing the long side of the building to the north and have more windows on the north, smaller windows on the east, west and south, helps to keep the building cool in summer and warm in winter. With this, low winter sun can come in deep into the space and heat the inside, and then the greenhouse effect is actually harnessed to heat the building. The opposite happens in summer when you have large overhangs to keep the sun off the windows, as you can see in the little drawing. The materials a building is made of play a very important role. A metal sheeting roof must be insulated to keep the heat inside in winter and outside in summer. Most of the heat gain in a building is through the roof, because that is the surface that gets most sun through the day. The thickness of the walls also make a difference. Materials like brick have what we call high thermal mass. It means they can absorb a lot of heat from the hot side, but they do it slowly, and they release it slowly to the colder side. The thicker the wall is, the longer it takes to release. So a wall heated up in the day can release heat at night, when it might be required. And if it's cooler outside, most of the heat also goes outside. So where we have hot days and cool nights, like Namibia in summer, thermal mass works really well. This process of delay is called time lag. Passive design is also about what we find around buildings. This picture is not about buildings, it's about the paving and the grass. Most of us will look at this and think, oh my goodness, it's so untidy. They should scuffle the grass to clean it up. But the grass has an important role. It reduces erosion, it retains water in the soil, it reduces dust, cools the air, it minimizes glare, it enhances biodiversity, and it's also a seed bank for growing grass there and elsewhere in future. These little sketches show the difference between areas with natural ground cover, which absorbs 50% of rainwater, release 40% through slow evapotranspiration, which cools the surrounding, and loses only 10% to runoff. This can be compared to paved surfaces, which absorb 15% or less water, and loses 85% to runoff and fast evaporation. I can also talk about the role of daylight in buildings and so on in terms of passive design, but it's a very wide topic, so I'm going to be quite compact in what I describe here. So let's go to frugal design from passive design. Frugal means being stingy in a good sense, and here size definitely matters. The less you build, the smaller you build, the better. There are also strategies for this. Houses used to have a lot of separate rooms, but nowadays with open plan design, a lot of space is saved in the kitchen, dining and living areas as it reduces passages and circulation space. We still need to do a bit of work on our bedrooms. If we want to go further than that, we could think of multi-purpose spaces rather than single-purpose spaces like bedrooms which are only used at night and living spaces which are only used during the day. The main stumbling blocks to implementing this are our habits and expectations and our furniture. In many cultures, people sit on the floor to eat and socialize. They leave their shoes outside and they have very clean floors, and they roll out their bedding at night to sleep in the same space. This also happens in informal settlements in Namibia as need dictates. For most of us, that's not a desirable option. But with multi-purpose fold-up and or mobile furniture, we can save a lot of space. Look at this table. Instead of a full walk-in bedroom, what about a couch or bed in an alcove that's open sometimes for a lounge and screened off sometimes for sleeping? Or a bed in a platform above another sleeping cubicle? These examples are all of houses, but this can work at schools as well to some extent. At Rukunga School, the one you saw earlier, a large veranda on the side of the hall is opening onto the parade ground. Not only does it act as a kind of stage for the parade ground, but it has large sliding doors to the hall, so that if the hall is too full, one can add extra seating outside and people on the parade ground can then participate in what is inside. So it effectively doubles the size of the hall. It's important for many people that their buildings must be as grand as possible. However, this is not just expensive, but has very bad impacts on the environment. It's definitely not green building, no matter how many solar panels you put on. Unnecessary features are added, decorative features, and they increase material use and carbon footprint. Buildings are bigger than they need to be, and high-impact materials are used, like a lot of glass. The durability of materials and fittings are also an important green consideration. You may use something with low embodied energy, but if it breaks quickly and must be replaced often, it's not green. We've spoken a bit about the harm infrastructure does to the environment and habitat loss through material extraction and production. It is probably as great a problem as climate change. Being frugal, using less, makes a big difference. So let's move on to materials. Embodied carbon, or embodied energy, represents all the energy used during the entire life cycle of a material, from extraction through its lifetime to disposal. It's measured in kilograms of CO2 emitted per kilogram of material. On this table, aluminium has the highest score, but we use very little in terms of weight aluminium. Concrete's rating is low, but think of how much we use. How many kilograms of concrete go into a building? The cycle from extraction to disposal is usually referred to as the cradle-to-grave cycle. However, green building aims for cradle-to-cradle or a circular system. You'll often hear the term circular economy. There's now a whole field in terms of life cycle assessments of products, especially in buildings, where everything from extraction, manufacture, transport and construction is evaluated, right through to operations, refurbishment, and if necessary, demolition and recycling. Ideally, we shouldn't demolish, but if we do, the materials must be recycled. The impact of materials on people is also important. We don't have much sick building syndrome in Namibia, as we do not use such a lot of toxic materials, but it is a problem in large buildings with closed air conditioning systems. Materials that emit gases or off-gas chemicals, like volatile organic compounds, are the culprit. These are found in highly manufactured products like carpets, composite materials, paints, and so on. So if you work in a big bank building, you might get sick building syndrome. Unless you're working in a green bank building, which is a different story. This image shows the impact of pollution on your health, and it's not pleasant viewing. For example, look at what VOCs do. They are a cancer risk and they can cause nausea, skin irritation, and other things. Alternative building materials are often promoted. They're not always cheaper, but they are more natural, thus causing less damage to the environment, less pollution. They are often found close by to the site and thus need less transport, so they have less embodied energy. And they can be built with local skills, thus creating employment. Earlier you saw that green infrastructure needs to be planned carefully from the start, in terms of all of these points, before we start construction. Without this, we cannot have green building, but it isn't everything. Once we start building, the construction process must also be green. This means various things like restricting the impact area where the builders can go, avoiding pollution from, for example, cement runoff, sourcing materials like sand sustainably, minimizing waste, and so on. This needs monitoring and evaluation and cannot be left up to building contractors alone. So let's move on to building services and technology, which is where building occupants have to become more active. While a green building does its passive things in the background, technology brings in the active part. With energy, the source is of course crucial, whether it's from renewable energy like solar or carbon-intensive sources like coal-powered power stations. Then it's important to reduce the demand as much as you can. Firstly, through passive design, of course, and also through training. For example, teaching people to switch off equipment in standby. And also applying high-efficiency equipment such as LED light bulbs, low-energy refrigerators. A green approach to water has similar concerns. Where does it come from? Can we harvest rainwater and store it? Can we reduce the amount we use? And how much can we recycle? In Namibia, storage is the biggest issue because we need a lot of storage for our short rainy season. How we get rid of our dirty water is very important. We generate grey water mainly from washing ourselves, our food, and our clothing. And with some technology, this can be recycled fairly easily. However, black water from kitchen sinks and toilets containing fats, oils, and human waste is still a problem, as the technology for that is very expensive. And this brings me to the elephant in the outhouse, the toilet. It's a scandal that we use drinking quality water in Namibia to flush our toilets. Grey water for flushing is much better, but we should reconsider the use of waterborne sewage completely. I can see you shaking your heads. No, no, no. Oh, we must have flush toilets. But just think about it. If they can use dry sanitation in a prominent office building like the Bullitt Center in America, shouldn't we reconsider our insistence on flush toilets? We generate solid waste, not just by using a building, but also during construction, which must be taken into account during all the stages of the process. Here, concepts of the circular economy become particularly pertinent. And UN Habitat is working on a program for that with Namibia right now. I'm sure you've had a lot of exposure to waste management already, with the 6R concepts familiar to you, so let's not dwell on it more. To really know whether a building is green, things should be measured. Earlier I spoke about net positive in the context of regenerative design. It comes from the term net metering, which means measuring the difference between input and output for various aspects of a building. For example, how much energy does a building generate minus how much it uses? If the answer is a positive number, this means net positive. In many cases of green building, people are still aiming for net zero. We're very far from getting there, but you'll see a lot of references to net zero water, net zero energy, net zero waste. It's most often used in the context of building services, but it can also refer to a project as a whole, looking at its overall life cycle assessment. When there's a common understanding and people are trained well, it's still necessary to continue with such awareness raising. As user populations change, people forget. For example, people mustn't only understand what actions are green, but carry them out as well, like dressing appropriately for the season, opening windows for night flushing and cooling buildings, switching off lights and appliances on standby, and so on. I'm going to stop here as I think you've been bombarded with enough info already. I just want to remind you of what I said at the beginning. A broad understanding of principles is better than knowing a list of facts. I hope you enjoyed this and that you'll benefit from what you've learned here and that you'll be able to teach others some of it.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you. Absolutely super, beautifully illustrated and represented presentation. It really brings an architect's vision to life. Yeah, just really wonderfully visual. Thank you so much. I was just talking, I was just thinking with my colleague Mariette that it would be amazing to be equipped with the knowledge that you have or to have the advice of a Nina before one does do some building. And I was just thinking about the house that I live in, which is it's a very ancient house, and it's a very it's just such a non-living, breathing house. It's very and I think it really determines your whole quality of family life, where there is no sort of central area to live in, and it's a very non-green building. So yeah, I love what you've presented, and I really hope that in the future, if I can build another home, then it will definitely be influenced by what you've presented to us. So thank you for that. So I'm going to open the floor up for any questions that anybody might have. I'm going to, I don't think we've got anything in the chat yet, no. So yeah, if there's any questions, we would be very welcome. Oh, here we go, one from Johan. Johan, do you want to ask your own question or do you want me to ask it for you? I can go ahead. So Johan asks, when we are building and maintaining our homes and offices, are there enough healthy and sustainable materials available and accessible to the public and contractors? Are there environmental certification options we can look for when buying materials such as paint, for instance? And thank you very much for an interesting and comprehensive presentation.
Okay, that's a question which is a bit like how long is a piece of string, but I'll try and answer it quite clearly. Healthy materials for people and sustainable materials for the environment aren't always the same thing. So, for instance, something that's really healthy that you import from Sweden might have an high embodied energy footprint, and therefore it's less good for the environment, but it's good for your health. So it's always a question of weighing up the pros and the cons. Things are a lot better than they were when I did the Habitat Center, well, probably almost 20 years ago. I would call paint manufacturers and I'd say, I'm looking for a low VOC paint. And they'd say, what? What's that? Nowadays, if you go to the paint shops, they all say the paint is low VOC. Okay. In terms of certifications of materials, we don't have a facility within Namibia where we can certify materials like that. You really have to go into the product literature and see what they say. You have to educate yourself quite a lot. You know, if you want to get engaged in green building of any kind, either you get a fully trained professional to handle everything for you, or if you're going to do a lot yourself, you must do some self-education. The knowledge I have, I didn't do a course or anything. I literally taught myself, you know, step by step. I went to conferences, I read books, I read articles. I actually wrote papers in order to learn through it for conferences. Because unless you sit yourself down and you say, I'm going to do this paper now, you don't really end up doing the research. You've got to have a goal. In terms of certifying your building, for larger buildings, there's the Green Star system, Green Star rating system, which is run by the Green Building Council of Namibia. You can go and look on Facebook and you'll find them there. There's also a system which the IFC, International Finance Corporation, runs, but also works through GBCNA, which is called EDGE. And that's specifically for houses and so on. There's a free online introduction course on EDGE, which you can do, and that will also help you. By understanding the rating system, you'll see what things are being looked at. And so you can educate yourself about what are the aspects of green building that there is. But you know, you can read everything, from popular articles to things on the internet to coffee table books about healthy living and so on. I've got a little paperback book that was published sometime in the 80s about how to have a green home, and it just has lists and lists of, amongst others, chapters of chemicals and what they do. You know, so polyurethane foam, for instance, when it burns, gives off cyanide gas. So if I hear the word polyurethane, all the alarm bells start ringing. Most foam mattresses that you can buy are polyurethane foam, and one of the reasons so many people in shack fires die is because they get poisoned by the cyanide gas before they wake up and can get out, which is a horrible thing. So I think the question is, there is a lot available, but you must educate yourself about what is available. And that's where the understanding and the rules of thumbs come into play. The closer, the more natural the material, and the closer it is, the greener it is, whatever your comparison is.
Thanks, Nina. So Johan says, thought-provoking answer. Thank you. Nina, just on a financial level, if one is considering doing green building, how, financially, is it as, does it compare with kind of conventional building?
Okay, if you're talking formal buildings, institutional buildings, banks, offices, and so on, it used to be much more expensive. But there's recent research that has been done by the Green Building Council in South Africa. There's a company called Solid Green Consulting. They do building consulting, and they provide a lot of this information. And not only has a lot of the buildings become cheaper, but they also become cheaper to run because they're more energy efficient, more water efficient, etc. And if a building is healthy, you've got less staff days off, etc. When it comes to your house, it depends on whether you're going for the champagne or the beer version of sustainability. It's entirely up to you. You know, so if you do stone building in Namibia, it's more expensive because it's harder work and you need people who can do it. But if the stone is on your farm and the stone is there anyway, and you can build up your stock over some time with spare labor, then it will be much cheaper than getting bricks in. So again, context based. So it's very it's not something that you can say, sure, green building is so expensive, I can't do it. When you do a very big building, there is a cost to having it certified, which is about 1.5% of the building cost that goes into your certification, consultancy, preparation, and all that. But in the end, if you look at your running costs and so on, it probably saves you money. So yes, it's a kind of a give and take situation. And when you think about the costs of environmental damage and climate change that we're looking at in the future, the bit of extra money that you spend now is actually going to have a huge return in the future.
Not just for yourself, obviously. Yeah.
Yes, your house is cool in summer and warm in winter. You don't need to buy air conditioners to put in it when the time it heats up another 2 degrees.
Nina, I see a question from CL Vaughan in the chat. CL, one of my colleagues. Thanks, CL. She's asked, what role can or do local communities play in the planning and execution of green building projects?
Okay. When we speak about environmental sustainability, we do include the social and the financial. You know, it is the triple bottom line situation. You can't ignore the community issues while just going for the green issues. So obviously, if you're working on a community project in a community area, you've got to work with the community. And part of the process is a certain amount of education. But also I found communities very interesting because often there's a lot of hidden traditional knowledge. For instance, I was building, when we were working on the Habitat Center, we ended up using lime wash for the walls because all the paints had VOCs in them. And I was chatting to the foreman the one day and he said to me, oh yes, when he was a child, they used to burn lime. They used to make their own lime from the limestone that they found on the farm. You know, there's a process whereby you burn the stone and then you powder it and then you slake it to make hydrated lime, and then you use it for the paint. And it is very interesting because these are things that I didn't know. And then when it came to the practicalities of building with sandbags, building with carb, and so on, this oldish foreman had a lot of practical advice. So I think the thing is, when you're working with communities, you actually need to make sure that you tap on the resources that there are. One of the things that I find now is that communities are generally very much aware of the overall issues of climate change, biodiversity, and so on. With the conservancy movement and all of that in Namibia, people are very educated. But when it comes to building, people are quite starry-eyed about having my 3-bedroom brick house with a zinc roof. And often it's not the most sustainable option. I'm quite happy a small community in the Nana Conservancy area that I've been working with on the side of an organization who started a sandal making business, community business. They're now making the same sandals that they used to make for themselves decades ago in this business. They've now got encouraged to actually build the houses again out of the branches and grass, local grass. And I saw some recent photographs and they look beautiful. And they're so much better than the corrugated iron and plastic sheet and shacks that they've been living in before. So there's a lot of space for community, you know. Using community labor in your building projects, trying to do training in skills while you're doing that is important because that leaves a bit of a legacy. Sorry, my cat is talking, I hope it's not. And some
Thanks, Nina.
a lot of space for it.
I see Alyssa's got her hand up, so welcome.
You must unmute, Melissa.
Yes, yes, I did.
There we go.
Thank you, Nina. I'm so glad you mentioned a lot of these terms that we've also been discussing with our teachers, such as, I think the first step is eco-literacy, not just in now in the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, but actually now learning how to change and adapt in the building environment. And also the point about the indigenous knowledge is really, I find that a very exciting field. But I find there's very little knowledge on green building. Now in Namibia, I feel like from my perspective, you're one of the very few experts in this field when you say you've self-taught, or that you've got a lot of experience. How would you suggest, or what is the next step besides just education? But I actually just have so many questions. I don't know where to start, but I feel like what would be the next step besides just educating ourselves? If these are teachers in their communities and they have to, and maybe I'm going to latch onto the question that's in the chat. So, how do you retrofit buildings to become more sustainable, but using natural materials in the school environment? And the second part of that question is more also, aren't the building regulations at the moment a little bit of a challenge as well to that? I feel like I don't know enough about the building regulations on how schools, for example, have to be built, or any building, and whether that's not maybe also another sort of challenge, or like a hurdle.
Okay, Kirsten was referring to her own house earlier. And you remember in the talk I said an existing building is always more green than a new one, Kirsten. So your existing house is already more green than any greenhouse that you can build. Buildings can be adapted, You put in insulation in the roof to avoid having to use heating in the winter. You can open up windows to the north side. There are all kinds of, in the passive design department especially, there are a lot of changes that you can do that really will improve the comfort levels inside and therefore reduce your reliance on electricity for lighting and for heating and cooling. When it comes to natural materials versus conventional materials, no government school will allow you to use alternative materials. And the problem is maintenance. Most alternative materials need extensive maintenance. There are a few here and there, like hydroform, for instance, which is a stabilized compressed earth block. You get a lot of versions of those, but I like hydroform because it was invented in Namibia. Those can work for schools, but it will take quite a while to get the ministry to, somebody has to go and advocate for it. The ministry probably has to buy a machine and then make sure that the contract is, prescribed that that contract is responsive. And that, I'm afraid, actually also starts with the architects. So I've built classrooms for the Rossing Foundation using hydroform, but they've never been used elsewhere. Gashika Kamal tried to have a school in Katutura built out of sandbags, and the government, they just kicked in their heels. I think the thing is that natural materials which need a lot of maintenance are mostly suitable for private ownership dwellings. They're not that suitable for institutional. Unless, for instance, it's kayak, and people at kayak are learning how to build other things and also to maintain it. So, on their property. When it comes to sustainability in institutional buildings, durability is probably the biggest factor there. and then frugal design. You know, don't go and put in big statement elements like there's a huge concrete wall in front of the Inasta building that does nothing. It's just decorative. Always apply the permaculture principle that everything that you do must do two things, and aesthetics is not one of them. It must be two functions, you know. So we talk about aesthetically beautiful, and we talk a lot about aesthetics and architecture, but we've got to remember that my taste is not the same as your taste. There are universal rules in aesthetics, but aesthetics mustn't dominate the sustainability. Sustainability must come first, and you must design. If you're a skilled designer, you will design in such a way that it will be aesthetically beautiful, but it will be sustainable. So it's a catch-22. I think when it comes to school, let's say I'm now a teacher in a school and I want to green my school building. The first thing is to actually investigate what is unsustainable about the building and what is sustainable about the building. So you actually have to do a bit of a study about what's the orientation like. Is it hot because there's no insulation in the ceiling? Do people actually open the windows on opposite sides of the classrooms early in the morning to get the cold air through and then close it later so that they can keep the hot air out? So you look at the usage patterns, you look at the physical infrastructure, and then you come up with a set of priorities of what is the most important. I often think heat and ventilation is critical when it comes to schools, because if people are hot, they can't learn and they can't teach. If they don't get enough oxygen, they fall asleep. So that would be a priority for me. Then I would very much look at the outside. Our school buildings are all in, you know, the property becomes a desert because everything is just squirreled out. We need to plant trees. Trees are really important because they shade the buildings. They create a cooler atmosphere physically through the transpiration through the leaves. And the other thing is they also have a beneficial psychological effect that few people are aware of. There's been studies done that shows that areas of cities with higher vegetation percentages have less crime, and that's been correlated for income levels and all of that. So these are benefits. By planting, you can also teach children about planting. You can teach them about the indigenous trees. I was very pleased when my previous housekeeper called me up the other day and she says, Nina, I need some plants from your garden. I said, what? And she says, no, my son at school has to bring a branch of a certain plant, and it's an indigenous raisinberry. And I know you've got some in your garden. So the school was asking the children to each bring in an indigenous plant. They gave them the names and they had to go and search for it and then come to school with these, you know. So the next step would be to plant. So there's a lot that can be done in schools. It would be nice if I can get a small commission to come up with a little guideline booklet of what people can do in schools. It's just that time is a bit of an issue, and finances as well. But one could look at that.
Yeah.
It's a lovely idea.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alyssa. I see that there's a message in the chat from Johannes Kamutushi. Johannes asks, Nina, what are the strategies, procedures in place that society needs to consider when it comes to green building, taking into consideration the efficiency of resources?
Johannes, that's a very wide open question. I'm going to answer it as what I think you're asking. When you're talking about procedures and policies, there are current building regulations and so on, but nothing prevents us from being green and still complying with the regulations. If you green, you follow the regulations and you just go and do a little bit extra. In terms of strategies, I think teachers play a really, really important role, because education and understanding of the environmental problems that we face and the things that we can do about them actually starts right from childhood. We are in a situation now when most of our children have parents who've lost traditional knowledge. So we need to kind of bring traditional knowledge as well as contemporary knowledge about green building back. So I would say that even when you're doing maths, when you've got a maths problem, instead of saying so many apples plus so many apples, you say, if you're in the north, you say, okay, you've got so many ende fruit and you've got so many ende fruit. When you put them together, how many ende fruit do you have? So you contextualize things, you indigenize things. You look at kind of putting your maths questions, your English lessons, your history lessons, you put that into an environmental context. Something that I find is really interesting is that our history is full of these battles and those important people and so on, but nobody really looks at why these things happen. Why did certain people move from South Africa even before colonialism to come to Namibia and actually integrate it with the Nama tribe? It was because of environmental and economic reasons. Why did the Nama and the Herero fight? It was because of grazing grounds. What is the primary difference between Herero culture and Oshivambo culture? Oshivambo culture is sedentary and it grows crops, whereas Herero culture used to be nomadic, pastoralist. So what are the differences between these kind of cultures from an environmental point of view? If you look further in the world, for instance in Sudan, most of the warfare and the conflict there is because of environmental reasons. Two different cultures that have two different ways of using the environment start clashing because the environment, which was big enough for all of them 100 years ago, now isn't big enough anymore because of population explosion and so on. So there's so much that can, in terms of strategies in teaching, that I think can happen. Things like getting the little kids to go home and make a little plan drawing of their house and put in north. Where's the north point? And then looking at it in the class together and saying, but which rooms, if they live in a multi-room house, which rooms are hot and which rooms are cold? And why is that? Because some of them are north and some of them are south, some of them are west. These are all kind of things that one can bring into your lessons, which I think are great ways of teaching people. I always do that with the first year students when I have a chance to work with them at the university. And I say, okay, we make a little sketch of your house, you put it in north, and I'm going to look at it and I'm going to ask, which is your bedroom? And then I look at the bedroom and I say, that bedroom's hot in summer. And they say, how do you know? So these are things that you can do.
Thanks, Nina. I want to see whether there's any more questions for Nina. And otherwise, we're going to close off. Nina, I think you've given us a lot of wonderful time. Oh, here we go. Darren. Darren, welcome. You can ask Nina your question.
Hi, thank you. So I'm just catching on to what you were just speaking about. And I think it's very interesting. I was also just running through your habitat building, which is really great. And there's an image in there, which I think fits in nicely here with what also you said about things having more than one purpose. So if we consider that the building actually has more than one purpose through the lens of a teacher, that means that it's not just the environment that you're teaching in, but actually a tool that you can teach about. And the image I'm looking at is those refuse yard. The roof was made from recycled oil drums. And so I think what that kind of opens up the mind, a child might be passing under that, look up and realize, hey, I recognize that. And instead of just seeing an oil drum as an oil drum, suddenly an oil drum becomes a roof. And so have you done it, or have you known, or is there ideas that you have or that you can recommend in how teachers could teach using the building or the architecture as a kind of tool of teaching?
In terms of the Habitat Center, teachers can take the learners there and they can walk them through the building. They are completely open into that, they like that. But obviously that's not accessible to people outside Windhoek. There is quite a bit of material on the Habitat Centre on the internet. So if people want to get pictures and show it to children and have them look at it, depending on which area they are in, there might be a building. Like for instance, we did the hydroform buildings in Ondangwa. So if they're teachers in Ondangwa, they can go and look at the Rossing Foundation hydroform buildings in Ondangwa. There's also a little craft centre just opposite the Protea Hotel behind the filling station that we built out of sandbags. So they can go and have a look there. There are examples in different places of the country. So I suggest that if you want to, through indeed, sending questions and so on, I'm quite happy to help out. Then Nadine can maybe distribute the answers. But there are also, one of the things I always do when I go to building sites is I go and do a materials audit. I look at what's there. And sand, for instance, in Namibia is sand and stone are the most prominent, most ubiquitous materials. So I've done quite a few buildings in sandbags and helped people who build sandbag buildings. On the internet, it's called earth bag. So you can research earth bag on the internet. So yeah, there's so much that you can learn. But this thing that you mentioned about the lateral thinking, that you look at an oil drum and then you start seeing that it's a roof, that comes into creativity. And because they've taken art classes out of the school, I think one must bring art into every lesson, because that creativity is what makes people learn and understand better. Yeah. So it could be even having a class where kids have to go and find one material that there's a lot of in the environment, bring a sample to school, and then have a discussion about what can you do with this material. Can you build with it? Can you use it for food? What are the opportunities inherent in a material?
Great, thank you.
So Nina, that brings us very beautifully into the next question, which is from Mara Bucas. She says, wow, so interesting. How can this be linked to lessons in the class?
As I said, kind of look at your work plan and your teaching material and see how can I convert this into environmental and building type questions. I think there's quite a bit of scope for that. How to make things more interesting, class exercises and so on. Because I've never been a fan of rote learning. You've got to have a certain basic knowledge. But if you learn it through other means instead of parrot fashion, you end up remembering it much better. So activities, games, small projects, drawing things, all of that can be used to bring these ideas into the classroom. You can also say to the Ministry of Education, why don't you get Nina to rewrite or green the English curriculum for green building, But then obviously other things come into that as well, conservation, biodiversity and so on. It's not just green building. No.
Fantastic. Andreas, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. I think, very interesting. I think one of the things that really stuck with me in the beginning was in your presentation, you said green building is a process. And I think that's part of it. It's even if you have a building that's existing, you always have to do something and you can always adapt to it. So it's more the mindset and the action you take that then makes it better. Whatever you have, if it's not good, you can make it better. And I mean, we have to do it all the time as well with our buildings at Nadine. We always adapt them, we change things. We've got a new building in Swakopmund it's an existing house that we need to deal with. So maybe one of the things that I think what I really miss with architects, and maybe it's a bit of a costing as well, is measuring the footprint. So water, waste, electricity, how do you measure it? And that very often the buildings don't make it easy, or the designers don't make it easy to find these things. And one just gets to build and so on. But it's also part of the education. But it is one of the things that I think teachers can use. Try to find the water meters and read them. Try to find the electricity meters and read them. And if you don't have the meter, maybe try to get the bill. So I don't know how that works in institutional buildings, but that would be one part. And sorry, just very quickly. And the other thing would be, for example, you could calculate what kind of impact the building had. You could count bricks, for example. With grade 1 learners, you can just go count bricks and say how heavy are they. You could count how much sand they would use, etc., etc. So as an architect, you have to calculate a lot of things. Mathematics is a big part of it. So you can recalculate what a wall, how many bricks you need in a wall, etc. Yeah. So I think creativity is important.
Yeah, you could take a water reading at the beginning of the school term, and then 2 weeks later, you take another reading, so you see the use in those 2 weeks. And then you have a little campaign about not flashing yellow, but flashing brown. You know the saying, when it's yellow, let it mellow. When it's brown, flash it down. You know, this thing about not letting the tap run when you wash your hands, but just wetting it, closing it, washing, and then rinsing. And then say, okay, let's do this for 2 weeks, and then we measure again, and then see the difference. You know, these are practical exercises in school. Measuring is important, so you have to have the right meters and things. But I was thinking the other day that I'd like to have an app plug in on our computer software that would actually look. The quantity surveyors have things that calculate the number of bricks and so on and so on. But what I'd like to have is a plug-in to that actually gives the embodied energy. You know, and yes, I think there's a lot of scope for artificial intelligence for that. I'm working on that idea. We're probably not going to do it in Namibia, but maybe with this UN Habitat project we can look at it.
Computer science in school, they can come up with something.
Well, I'm not a computer boffin, so I wouldn't know. But maybe the people at NAST's computer division can actually look at that in conjunction with a quantity survey. I'm going to suggest that to them. No.
Thank you.
Yeah. But the computer students in the school can actually use, they can log the records and do the comparisons, you know, so do graphs, and when they're learning Excel, how to do a graph that represents the usage, etc.
Thanks, Andreas. Thanks, Nina. Do we have any more questions in the room? I can't see any more in the chat. Okay, Nina?
I just want to say one thing. I'd really like to have some feedback from the teachers about how they found this, if they found it baffling, if there was terminology that they didn't understand, how they think they can use it. So if people would just send Nadit messages and say, I like this, I didn't like this, I want to know more about this, and so on, just so that I know better about what I must do next time. It always helps to get that kind of feedback, and don't worry about being critical. If you want to say, oh, this was a lot of trash, I didn't understand a thing, or, oh, it's just so simple, I knew all of that already, why waste my time? You're welcome to say that, because then I know.
Thanks, Nina. Okay, no, we'll get some feedback back to you. And yeah, you're saying maybe some of us didn't learn anything, but I think that all of us are leaving with great gems on green building and a whole lot more. Okay, Nina, I think that we're going to give you some time out now. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. I really, really loved it. And yeah, thank you to the audience. Marette's clapping there. And yeah, super, super. You've set a lovely standard for our series. So thank you so much for sharing.